Hi, I'm Drew Millen, Director of Products at Latitude. In this short tech tip video, we're going to talk about workflow, specifically how you can make Essentials workflows inside of the Geocortex viewer for HTML5 run when you perform an identify operation. So let's dive in. In this tech tip, I'm going to show you how to use identify workflows. Those are Geocortex Essentials workflows that piggyback on top of the identify functionality. In this site, I've got the default identify behavior working. So when I perform identify, I'm going to find cities on top of this map. I want to run a workflow every time I perform an identify as well. Let's look at the configuration file that supplies the configuration for this viewer. There's a module in here called identify, and we want to configure the identify behavior. This is the desktop.json.js file that configures the viewer we were just looking at. Notice that the identify module has a section called identify providers. It's here that we specify what logic will run when an identify by the user is performed. For example, querying the graphics layer, querying the map itself. And then down here, I've added a workflow identify provider. I've also supplied some configuration to this identify provider so that it's looking for workflows in my site with the suffix _identify. Any workflow that I've added to my site with this suffix will be run by this workflow identify provider. With that in place, let's author our workflow. I'm going to open up the Geocortex Workflow Designer. If you go into the File menu and click on New, you'll see that we've provided a template for creating identify workflows. This template supplies a basic example to get you started. If you look at the arguments, an identify workflow is expecting a geometry as an input argument. That geometry comes from the identify that the user performs. It's also expecting a GUID or a unique identifier just for some bookkeeping. We can pretty much ignore that property. The other properties are output arguments, things that your workflow must supply. For example, the feature set that's returned from your query or whatever operation that you're doing, the display name for that collection of features, any aliases and formats that you want to use for the features that come back as well. In this example, we simply query a sample layer from ArcGIS Online that looks at states. The geometry from the identify operation is passed in as a parameter to perform that identify. We assign the display name to be states. We supply some aliases for some of the fields that are going to come back so that it's readable for the user. And we supply some format strings for features that are going to be displayed in the map tips and results list. With this workflow developed, we should attach it to our site so that it can be run every time we perform an identify. Let's look at this application in Geocortex Essentials Manager, and I'll navigate down to the Workflows tab where I want to attach this workflow we were just looking at. Recall that it has to have an _identify suffix to be picked up by my workflow identify provider. I'll give it the name hello world _identify. This is just a pretty basic example. And now it's looking for the URL or the URI of the workflow that I just authored. So I'm going to browse for that. And I'm going to go into the directory that we have for this site here. And I want to upload it into a folder that I created called resources. It's stored on my workstation as hello world identify.xaml. I'll go ahead and upload it to that directory and choose that. Now Geocortex Essentials Manager is smart enough to know that this workflow has parameters, so I'm being prompted to supply those here. Because the geometry and the GUID are going to be provided by the identify workflow operation, we don't need to supply these here. Now the workflow is attached to my site, so I'll go ahead and save it. Let's refresh our viewer and see the resulting behavior. I'm going to run a workflow again, an identify again, which should identify the cities, but it should also run my workflow and grab the states. Here we can see the result of my states workflow populating the list of results that I expected. To view a more sophisticated example, we've also done the same thing by integrating a workflow that uses the Twitter API to find tweets within a geographic area. In this case, I'm going to perform an identify at San Francisco Airport and discover all of the geographic tweets that have been added in this area in the last hour. And you can see all of the results are coming here. This is a more sophisticated example of using an identify workflow in a Geocortex viewer for HTML5 application. To learn more, please get in touch. Thanks for watching.